I learned to be quiet before I learned to speak. Not because I was naturally shy, but because the first time I made noise as a child, really made noise, the kind of joyful shouting that comes from being 4 years old and alive, my mother appeared in the doorway of my room with her finger pressed to her lips. "Shh, we have guests." We always had guests. My name is Amelia Bolshin, and for the first 18 years of my life, I was a secret kept in plain sight. The house I grew up in had 12 bedrooms, a ballroom, and a garden that required 3 full-time staff to maintain. It was featured in Architectural Digest twice. Politicians attended parties there. Charity galas were held in the East Wing. My father's name appeared regularly in the financial sections of major newspapers. I lived on the 3rd floor, in a beautiful room that no one ever entered except the housekeeper who brought my meals. I was born 3 months before my parents' wedding, an inconvenient truth, a mistake that couldn't be undone, but could, with enough money and careful management, be hidden. My mother, Catherine Bolshin, daughter of a steel magnate, graduate of Vassar, board member of half a dozen prestigious organizations, had gotten pregnant. Not scandalous in itself, except that in her world, in her family, everything was about timing and image. A child before marriage was acceptable if you were young and reckless and your family could spin it as modern love. But my mother was 34. My father, Jonathan Bolshin, was 41. They were serious people, established people, the kind of people who lived according to rules, even when they broke them. So they married quietly, quickly, and when I was born, I became the thing they never discussed. I don't have early memories of warmth. I have memories of silence, of being told to stay upstairs when the doorbell rang, of learning to move through the house like a ghost, keeping to the back stairs, avoiding the main rooms where voices and laughter echoed. There are no photographs of me in that house, none on the walls, none in albums, none on my mother's desk or my father's office shelves. My brother was born 2 years after me. Proper timing, proper circumstances. His name is William. There are hundreds of photographs of William. I watched him grow up from a distance, watched him learn to walk, to talk, to charm every adult who entered our home. I watched my mother's face light up when he entered a room. I watched my father ruffle his hair with casual affection. I was 7 when I understood I wasn't supposed to exist. It was Christmas Eve. The house was full of people, my father's business associates, my mother's society friends, relatives I'd never been introduced to. I'd been told to stay in my room, as always, but I was 7 and I wanted to see the Christmas tree. So I crept down the back stairs and stood in the shadowed hallway where I could see into the grand room without being seen. The tree was enormous, 20 feet tall, covered with crystal ornaments that caught the light like frozen stars. Presents spilled out beneath it in a careful arrangement that probably been styled by the same person who decorated the rest of the house. William was there, 4 years old, being passed from lap to lap, receiving gifts and praise and attention. My mother stood near the fireplace in a green velvet dress, holding a glass of champagne, laughing at something someone had said. And my father was telling a story. We always knew we wanted 2 children, a boy and a girl, but God had other plans, just our William, our perfect boy. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that no one questioned it. I stood in that hallway and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak, that would come later. What I felt then was understanding. I was the flaw in their perfect narrative, the complication they'd solved by pretending I didn't exist. I went back upstairs. I didn't cry. Even then, I was learning that tears were pointless when there was no one to witness them. But I also started watching, really watching, because when you're invisible, people forget you can see them. I learned things a child shouldn't know, things that years later I would understand were the foundation of everything my family built their reputation on. I learned that my father's business success wasn't just hard work and intelligence, it was strategic friendships, insider information, deals made over scotch in the library when everyone else had gone home. I learned that my mother's charity work was less about helping people and more about maintaining her position in a social hierarchy that required constant performance. I learned that my brother, William, the golden child, the heir, was struggling in ways no one acknowledged, that he wet the bed until he was 9, that he had panic attacks before school, that my mother gave him pills to help him focus, pills that made him quiet and compliant, and exactly what they needed him to be. I learned that marriages like my parents weren't built on love, they were built on mutual benefit, on image, on the careful construction of a life that looked perfect from every angle. And I learned to be silent, to observe without being observed, to understand without being understood. The housekeeper, Marie, was the only person who spoke to me regularly. She was the one who brought my meals, who helped me with schoolwork. I was homeschooled by tutors who came and left through the service entrance, who sometimes sat with me in the evening and told me stories about her own children. "You're a smart girl, Amelia," she told me once. I was 12. "You see things other people miss. That's a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one right now." "What am I supposed to do with it?" I asked. "You'll know when the time comes." I didn't believe her then. High school happened in isolation. College acceptance letters arrived to schools I'd applied to in secret, using the academic records my tutors had helped me compile. I got into 7 universities. I chose the one farthest from home, Northwestern, Chicago, far enough that I could build a new life, close enough that the distance felt like a choice, not an escape. I told my parents I was leaving on a Tuesday evening in August. I found them in the sitting room, reading, my father the Wall Street Journal, my mother a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. "I'm leaving for college on Saturday," I said. My mother looked up. There was a moment, brief, barely perceptible, where something like surprise crossed her face, as if she'd forgotten I was old enough to leave, or maybe forgotten I existed at all. "That's nice, dear," she said. "Where are you going?" "Northwestern." "Journalism?" "Economics and psychology." My father didn't look up from his paper. "Do you need money?" "I have a scholarship and a job lined up." "Good." That was it. No questions about where I'd live, no offers to help me move, no tears or hugs or acknowledgement that their daughter was leaving home. I packed my things, 3 suitcases. Everything I owned fit into 3 suitcases because I'd spent 18 years learning not to accumulate anything that required space or attention. Marie drove me to the train station. She cried. I didn't. "You're gonna do wonderful things," she said, hugging me tight. "You're gonna be someone. I always knew it." "I thank you for seeing me," I whispered, when no one else did. Chicago was cold and loud and overwhelming and perfect. For the first time in my life, I was visible. Not because of my family name. I dropped Bolshin and used my mother's maiden name, Crawford, but because of who I was. I made friends, real friends, people who knew nothing about my family, my past, the strange isolated childhood I'd survived. I worked 3 jobs to pay for things my scholarship didn't cover. I studied obsessively.
I graduated with honors. I got a job at a consultant firm, then a better job at a private equity firm. Then I started my own company, analyzing businesses, identifying inefficiencies, restructuring operations for maximum return.
I was good at it, better than good, because I'd spent my entire childhood watching how systems worked, how people operated, how to see the truth beneath the performance. By the time I was 30, my company was worth $40 million. I'd built it entirely on my own. No family connections, no borrowed money, no last name that opened doors. Just work, intelligence, and the particular kind of insight that comes from being invisible for so long that you learn to see everything. I hadn't been back to the house in 12 years, hadn't spoken to my parents except for occasional brief emails. They'd never asked about my life. I'd stopped expecting them to. But I followed their lives online, watched from a distance as my father's business grew, as William struggled through boarding school, then college, then a series of jobs at companies my father's connections had secured for him. Watched as my mother continued her charity work, her social climbing, her carefully curated public image. And then the invitation arrived. The Bolzian Family Foundation was celebrating its 50th anniversary, a gala event, 500 guests, media coverage, a documentary crew filming for a PBS special about philanthropic legacies. The invitation was addressed to Amelia Crawford. They didn't even remember or acknowledge my real last name. I held that invitation for 3 days, turning it over in my hands, weighing my options. I could ignore it, continue living my separate life, let them have their celebration, their documentary, their carefully constructed narrative. Or I could go. Not for revenge, I'd stopped needing revenge years ago, but for something else, something I couldn't quite name but could feel building in my chest like pressure before a storm. I called my assistant. "Clear my schedule for next weekend. I'm going to Connecticut." The estate looked exactly the same. Bigger, maybe, from the outside, but the same. Same iron gates, same long driveway, same imposing facade that said old money and unquestionable respectability. Parking was being handled by valets. I waited in line in my rental car, a modest sedan, nothing flashy, and watched people arrive. Society figures, politicians, business leaders, the kind of people my parents had cultivated their entire lives. The valet opened my door, looked at me blankly. I wasn't wearing designer clothes, wasn't dripping in jewelry, wasn't anyone he recognized. "Invitation?" he asked. I handed it to him. He glanced at it and waved me through. Inside, the house was transformed. The ballroom, the one I'd seen only from doorways and hallways, was filled with round tables, each one perfectly set, crystal, china, flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. A string quartet played in the corner, waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Everyone was dressed in formal wear, laughing and networking and performing the intricate social dance that people like this spent their lives perfecting. I spotted my mother almost immediately. She wore midnight blue, her hair styled in the same elegant updo she'd favored for decades. She was holding court near the bar, surrounded by admirers. My father stood near the stage where the documentary cameras were set up, talking to the interviewer, gesturing expansively. And William, 30 years old now, handsome in the way wealthy mediocrity often is, standing with a blonde woman I assumed was his wife, looking vaguely uncomfortable in his tuxedo. None of them had seen me yet. I took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and found a seat at one of the back tables, watched, waited. The program began. My father gave a speech about legacy and responsibility. My mother talked about the importance of giving back. William introduced a video montage of the foundation's work, schools built, scholarships funded, communities supported. All of it true, all of it good work, and all of it built on a foundation of lies. The documentary director stood up. Before we break for dinner, I'd love to hear from some family members about what this legacy means personally. William, your parents have been incredibly generous in sharing their time. Is there anything you'd like to add about growing up in a family so committed to service? William stood, cleared his throat. I think the most important thing my parents taught me was that with privilege comes responsibility, that we have an obligation to help those less fortunate, and that family, being part of something bigger than yourself, that's what gives life meaning. Applause. Genuine, warm applause. I stood up. The movement caught the documentary director's attention. She looked at me, curious. Yes, did you have a question? Every head in the room turned. I could see my mother's face go pale, my father's expression freeze. Not a question, I said. My voice was steady, calm. A clarification about family. The director smiled, thinking this was part of the planned program. Of course, and you are? Amelia Bolsian. I'm Jonathan and Catherine's daughter, William's older sister. The silence that followed was absolute. William's mouth fell open. My mother gripped the edge of the table. My father's carefully maintained composure cracked just for a second before he tried to recover. The documentary director looked confused. I'm sorry, I think there's been some mistake. The family history we were giving indicates that they have one child. I know, that's what they've been telling people for 30 years. I stepped forward, into the aisle where the cameras could see me clearly. But it's not true. I'm the daughter they've hidden since the day I was born, the mistake they solved by pretending I didn't exist. My mother found her voice. Amelia, this is not the time or place. When would be the time, Mother? When would it be appropriate for me to exist? Because I've spent my entire life waiting for permission to be acknowledged, and it never came. I turned to address the room. 500 faces, cameras, documentary crew scrambling to decide whether to keep filming. They kept filming. I'm not here for revenge, I said. I'm not here to destroy the Foundation's work or to humiliate my family. I'm here because for 30 years I've been erased from a story I was always part of, and I'm done being silent. I looked at my father. You tell people you always wanted 2 children, but God gave you 1. That's a lie. God gave you 2. You chose to acknowledge 1 and hide the other, because I was born 3 months before your wedding, because my existence was inconvenient, because your reputation mattered more than your daughter. I looked at my mother. You taught me that image is everything, that what people think matters more than what's true, and I learned that lesson so well that I built my own life on the opposite principle. I built something real, something honest, something that doesn't require hiding who I am to maintain. I looked at William. He was crying, actually crying. You're not a bad person, Will. You're a product of the same system that erased me, the same need to be perfect, to perform, to live up to impossible standards. I don't blame you, but I need you to know I existed, that I was there, watching, understanding, even when no one saw me. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I own a company worth $40 million, I said. I built it with no family help, no connections, no borrowed credibility. I did it by seeing things other people miss, by understanding systems, by watching how people operate when they think no one's paying attention.
I paused. Let that sink in. Everything I am, I became because I had to, because I had no choice. But here's what I want you all to understand. Being invisible taught me to see. Being silent taught me to listen. Being erased taught me that the only validation that matters is the validation you give yourself. I turned back to the documentary director. You're making a film about legacy, about what we pass down, about what we build. So here's the truth about the Bolsian family legacy. It's built on the same thing a lot of wealthy legacies are built on: careful image management, strategic kindness. generosity that serves a purpose. That doesn't make the good work invalid, but it also doesn't make it pure. My father finally found his voice. "Amelia, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. I spent 18 years understanding, watching, learning." I met his eyes. "You're not villains. You're not even particularly unusual. You're just people who cared more about appearance than truth. And that's common. That's human. But it's also corrosive, and it's not how I choose to live." I turned to leave, then stopped, turned back. One more thing. The Amelia Crawford Foundation, my foundation, has been quietly funding education programs for displaced children for the last 5 years. Children who exist in the margins, who aren't seen, who need someone to acknowledge they matter. We've helped 3,000 kids so far. And unlike this foundation, we don't film it, we don't publicize it, we don't use it to build our image. We do it because it's right, because those children deserve to be seen. I looked at my mother one last time. That's the real legacy, not the one we perform for cameras, the one we build when no one's watching. I walked out. The cameras followed me to the door, then stopped. Behind me, I could hear voices rising, confusion, shock, the sound of a carefully constructed evening falling apart. I got in my rental car and drove away from that house for what I knew would be the last time. My phone started ringing before I reached the highway. William, then my mother, then my father, then journalists, then the documentary director. I turned it off. 3 days later, the story broke. Not because I told it, because 500 people had witnessed it, because it had been filmed, because truth, once spoken out loud, is very hard to suppress. The foundation survived. The work continued. My parents issued a statement about family privacy and personal matters, and asked for respect. William called me. We talked for 3 hours. He apologized for things that weren't his fault. I told him he was allowed to love our parents and also acknowledge what they'd done. We've spoken twice since then, carefully, cautiously building something that might eventually resemble a relationship. My mother sent a letter, handwritten, 7 pages, mostly justifications, some apologies, a lot of pain that she'd apparently been carrying for decades. I haven't responded. I might someday. My father hasn't reached out at all, and I'm okay with that. Because here's what I learned. You don't need the people who erased you to validate your existence. You don't need their acknowledgement to be whole. You don't need their approval to build something meaningful. You just need to decide that you matter, and then live accordingly. I'm 32 years old now. I run a successful company. I fund education for kids who need it. I have real relationships with real people who see me for who I am. I exist, not because my family finally acknowledged me, but because I finally acknowledged myself. And that's the only permission I ever needed.